This podcast is made possible by your support and your donations. Thank you. And by the purchase of my book called Everyday Buddhism, Real-Life Buddhist Teachings and Practices for Real Change. I will post an affiliate link to the book on Amazon in the show notes. And if you've already read it, please take a minute to rate and review. And also consider purchasing it again for a friend or family member as a gift. Welcome to Everyday Buddhism, making every day better by applying the proven tools found in Buddhist concepts. Welcome to episode 114 of Everyday Buddhism, making every day better. This is a special episode announcing the release of my new book as a Substack serial book. It's called Living Life as It Is, an honest narrative of my challenges practicing right view. Also, in case you missed it in the last episode, instead of skipping the end announcements this time, please keep listening after this special episode. Our Everyday Buddhism membership community and Sangha has moved to Patreon. And this is in an effort to engage more podcast listeners in the broader Patreon community, in the Everyday Sangha, and my Everyday Buddhism Substack. Stick around to hear the details. But now, on to the episode announcing my new book. I started writing my second book as journal entries in early 2020 at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. I've kept a journal on and off for most of my life, beginning as a child in a small leather diary with a lock and key. Journal writing has always been like therapy. Any writing is like therapy. And the shock of the pandemic triggered a journal writing therapeutic response in this spring of 2020. I read somewhere that it was hard to find journals of personal writing reflecting on the 1918 Spanish flu. Those who lived at the time commented that so many were ashamed of their behavior that they wouldn't share any writing. I wanted to write about how I was behaving, how I was thinking and feeling. I wanted to use my writing to observe my responses to the pandemic and the responses of those around me and on social media. I wanted to write truthfully about what I was thinking and feeling. It's now 5 years later. I have multiple journals filled and an initial word draft in process. But life keeps coming. I got older. And as life threw twists, turns, shocks, and horrors at all of us, it became apparent to me, from reading my own writing, that the people and things I thought I saw clearly were never what they seemed. And neither was I. As it says in the Lankavatara Sutra, quote, "Things are not what they seem, nor are they otherwise," unquote. And as Padmasambhava, the Indian Buddhist teacher who is said to have introduced Tantric Buddhism to Tibet, taught, quote, "All that appears and exists, the phenomena of samsara and nirvana, arise from the solidified habitual tendencies of labeling," unquote. So here I am, still writing what was to be my second book focused on right view. The stumbling block in getting it done was things in life kept changing faster and faster, and I had no idea whether I had any sense of right view anymore, or if I was helplessly lost in delusion. But I recently had an idea that would help me focus and share my writing in the midst of life and all its confusion and delusion, in the middle of life as it is. The idea is this: why not write this long hoped for second book in real time? Why not write for my Substack audience, releasing essays, chapters as I go, so that you, kind subscribers, can read as I write and comment too? So if this seems interesting to you, subscribe to my Substack, and not only will you be able to listen to my Words from My Teacher's podcast and read my occasional post on the Zen koans for every day section, but you will also be the very first readers of my second book, Living Life as It Is, an honest narrative of my challenges practicing right view. Now my hope, and something I am going to keep to for you and for me, is posting an essay or chapter weekly. So as of now, my plan is to release a post each Friday. Now last Friday, the 7th of February, was my first post, which I offered as a free post to all Substack subscribers, even non-paying, but it will continue as a paid publication. Please consider supporting my Dharma work. I will read the first post in this podcast episode to give you a taste of what's in store. And here goes. Introduction. There's a Spanish proverb that says, "Every head is a world." Nothing like a global pandemic to mess with your practice. Actually, mess with is too mild of a description of how I have been weathering the pandemic and the broader instability of the U.S. and globally. The three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, are a refuge, meaning remembering the teachings of the Buddha, which is the Dharma, and practicing them, and counting on the Sangha to be your support when you falter. But in early 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic and my faltering, I couldn't see the Buddha or remember the Dharma through the haze of my existential dread and disbelief. And the Sangha was in lockdown and just as confused as I was, as we all tried to figure out how to navigate this new life. My personal life was equally confusing and distressing. The people in my life, both close to me and virtual or real-life acquaintances, reacted to the pandemic in completely different ways, from each other and from me. I felt lost and trapped in my own personal web of horror. That's the thing about people, about life. You can't count on it. It acts one way one day and differently the next, completely different views. Same human desires for happiness. I knew that, theoretically. But when the shit hit, I couldn't find a refuge, not even in my Buddhist practice. Now, this book is not about the pandemic. Not exactly. This book is about the first practice of the Noble Eightfold Path, called right view, or sometimes referred to as right understanding. And there has been no better practice ground for right view or right understanding than living in a global pandemic during a rise in social and political unrest and increasing effects of climate change. I will share my personal experience or battle with right view and how, after decades of lay Buddhist practice, I saw how diluted my view of life could get as I lost myself in disturbing emotions. It's all fun and games until life gets hard. And I think that's what the Buddha was trying to teach us. Life got hard for me and everyone else when the COVID pandemic changed everything. I know it hasn't been as hard for me personally as it has for so many others all over the world, and that too is what I learned about right view. We may both be looking at the same sky, hinting that rain is coming, but for you, the dark sky means your plans for a picnic are threatened, and for me, it's the promise that the garden is going to get a nice drink and I won't have to water. but for someone else at a different place, it could mean a life-threatening flood. That's how the pandemic is. Now, I'm using the present tense to refer to the pandemic because at the time of this writing, in early 2025, it isn't exactly over. Public health and disease experts disagree in their assessments, even though the World Health Organization declared an end to the international public health emergency in May of 2023. In the words of the World Health Association chief, they made this declaration, quote, with great hope, unquote. Hope is a wonderful thing, but it isn't a promise. Worldwide cases, hospitalizations, and deaths had been slowly decreasing, but COVID-19 is still very much with us, causing the WHO to backtrack with this announcement in August 2024, saying, quote, COVID-19 infections are surging worldwide and are unlikely to decline anytime soon, unquote. And catching COVID is easier to do now than it was in previous years when masking was mandated in most places and the vaccine helped contain the spread and criticality. Add to that, the COVID virus itself continues to mutate with great speed and efficiency. As of February 2025, there have been 7,084,010 deaths globally. It's probably gone up since I wrote that. And as COVID-19 continues to be a threat, the science of what the virus is doing to our bodies has gotten better. Scientists and medical professionals now agree that SARS-CoV-2 is not just a respiratory disease, but also a vascular and neurologic infection. The following highlights the dangers of COVID-19 from the article, quote, Beyond Breathing, How COVID-19 Affects Your Heart, Brain, and Other Organs by Michael Merschel in the publication American Heart Association News. Because COVID-19 typically affects breathing and can lead to problems such as pneumonia, many people may think it's primarily a lung disease. It's not that simple, said Dr. Nisha Viswanathan, director of the long COVID program at the David Geffen School of Medicine at the University of California, Los Angeles. Quote, I would argue that COVID-19 is not a disease of the lungs at all, she said. It seems most likely that it is what we call a vascular and neurologic infection, affecting both nerve endings and our cardiovascular system, unquote. It's no surprise that experts say SARS-CoV-2, the name of the virus that causes COVID-19, is complex, with many of its pathways just beginning to be understood. But some things are becoming very clear. One of the best reviews of long COVID symptoms, Viswanathan said, appeared last January in Nature Reviews Microbiology. It detailed the disease's effects throughout the body, including the pancreas, blood vessels, and reproductive system. Quote, SARS-CoV-2 is excellent at triggering your immune system to go from 0 to 100, said Dr. Lindsay McAlpin, a neurologist who is director of the Yale Neuro-COVID Clinic in New Haven, Connecticut. That revving of the immune response leads to both a wide swath of inflammation and excessive blood clotting, she said. The inflammation that the virus triggers is systemic, unquote. Now, since the pandemic began, the threats from COVID-19 range from losing your life, losing the lives of family members, losing your job, losing your health from post-viral conditions, to just a bad cold. And the variety of ways people deal with it is equally distinct. Some people can't stop looking at it. Others can't look at it at all. I couldn't stop reading, doom scrolling, and trying to quickly earn a PhD in virology while most people around me didn't want to look at all or created an alternative reality that was based on their lives prior to 2020. It's hard to understand what it looks like from another's point of view. No one is inherently right, nor inherently wrong. That is what right view is all about. It's not that there is a single absolute right view, and therefore all other views are wrong. The practice of right view is more about understanding that there is no discrete right or wrong. There are only things in the present, things as they really are. Yet each of our views of those things can be very different, making seeing things as they are nearly impossible, especially during the extreme times of 2020 to the present. That's what I'm going to write about in this book, using my own voice, narrating my own experience. Taking you through my own struggle with right view will hopefully help you and me see how we can do better. I'll start by telling the story of how I lost myself in this struggle. The world got crazy, and what we became. When the world suddenly seemed to make little sense, when it felt like we were about to go careening off the edge, when a culture of tribalism, fundamentalism, authoritarianism, cultism, and apocalypticism made it harder and harder to cope and care, we were left only with anxiety, denial, and disaster fatigue, losing our connection and compassion for each other. Instead of quieting our minds, we went swirling into our personal scary stories while we solidified a habit of doom and rage scrolling. Instead of reconnecting to our why, our meaning, and our good hearts, we buried ourselves in fortresses built of fear, anger, and confusion in response to a world gone crazy. We became so embedded we couldn't see things as they are. We couldn't see that the pain we felt was exactly like the fear, anger, and confusion everyone else was feeling. We didn't know how to see our reality as their reality too. Losing minds, losing people. The pandemic wasn't the beginning of the world seemingly careening off the edge. It started maybe 5 to 10 years before, for me and for many in the U.S. It probably started to slowly shift years before that, but because I'm not a sociologist or anthropologist, my study of human behavior is limited only to my personal interactions with the behavior of people in my sphere, in real life and virtually. I've read those who do study human behavior and political shifts talk about how we've been on the road to increased tribalism, fundamentalism, and authoritarianism for many decades. In hindsight, I can see that, especially politically. But it's like the boiling frog analogy. It's been so gradual, with pauses of positivity and hope, in the things that affected my life anyway, that I only occasionally experienced the severity of the issues to the point that I was alarmed. It was in 2010 or 2011 when I first started feeling things were off. Even though the U.S. had recently elected its first black president, and a couple years after, the U.S. made same-sex marriages legal, and as someone on the liberal end of the political spectrum and someone in a 30-year same-sex relationship as of 2010, it seemed to me that there was every reason to think things were trending more positively and equitably. This was my perspective, the world inside my head. In fact, though, those two events seemed to turn up the heat and noise from those that perceived a black president and same-sex marriages as signs of moral decline. Those who saw our country on a path of destruction got louder and more aggressive in their communication, with social media as a platform for everyone with an opinion, and for the proliferation of fake news, the stage was set for a tribal war of words. It was then that I began to be shocked by the things people were saying. People I knew were freely expressing hatred and mistrust of people and groups they considered quote-unquote others. They were voicing racist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, and xenophobic views I would never have believed them to hold. And they were doing so openly, without shame. At that time, only Fox News and Rush Limbaugh were major players in keeping up the drumbeat of hate and division, but they were powerful players in creating mistrust and fear of everyone who wasn't American, white, heterosexual, male, and Christian. I, like many others, reacted by challenging the opinions of those who were swept up in this worldview. I would try to reason, share articles and facts, and generally try to appeal to the better selves I felt I knew them to be. It took a long time, but I eventually realized this wasn't working. And not only was I frustrated at my attempts to have a non-charged conversation, I too became angry. I started to feel aversion and strong dislike for these people, including some real-world acquaintances and neighbors and some in my own family. The suffering I and so many others fell into during these times illustrates the quotes I began this introduction with. We were living in the same shifting state of the world, but we couldn't see that. We could only see what was in our minds, and it wasn't pretty. That's the end of the introduction, or chapter 1. Consider subscribing to my Substack to receive continuing chapters of Living Life as It Is, an honest narrative of my challenges practicing right view. Links to the Substack are in the show notes, as well as links to the Patreon community. And if you subscribe, not only will you get the serial book postings, but also the Words from My Teachers podcast every week in your email. Support my Dharma work for only $5 a month or $40 annually. Next up, the new announcements for Patreon supporters that I talked about at the beginning of the podcast. We dissolved our private community on the Private Heartland platform and opened it up through Patreon. Patreon will make it more open and accessible for all supporters of this podcast who might like a place to hang out with others. Membership tiers have lower suggested donations, and one tier includes a free subscription to the Everyday Buddhism Substack, where you'll find my new book as serial posts, my other weekly podcast, Words from My Teachers, and a new Zen koans for everyday section, plus other articles and notes I post infrequently. I hope you check out the new Patreon community, where we have many places for discussion and the ability to join the once-monthly Everyday Sangha on the first Saturday of the month at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, and a drop-in gathering on the third Saturday at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. We have a new offering in the Patreon community, too. I will be inviting Buddhist and meditation teachers to offer guided meditations. We started with meditations by Kimberly Brown, a returning guest on the podcast. I will also have a mini podcast conversation with each teacher about their insights about meditation. This is a free offering for all of the membership community Patreon patrons. You can support this podcast and the other activities of Everyday Buddhism by becoming a Patreon supporter. If you don't follow me or Everyday Buddhism on any social media platforms we post in, you can go to the Everyday Buddhism website and become a member by joining the Patreon community. Go to www.patreon.com www.everyday-buddhism.com and click on the link that says membership. Or you can join directly through Patreon at patreon.com//everydaybuddhism. Links to joining are posted in the show notes. I thank all of you who now contribute. This podcast, the community, and the Sangha depend on your donations to continue to exist. I do not seek podcast sponsors and do not ask for financial commitments through paid podcast memberships. So my work and the cost needed to support what I do is entirely self-funded except for your donations. Please consider a one-time or continuing donation through Patreon or on my website's Donate tab. Or you could buy me a cup of coffee on the Coffee Cup link on the website. You can find all these links again in the show notes. And thanks too to all of you who write in with comments and questions. I read them all, but can't always respond immediately. Another way you can help is to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. It's important for you to share the podcast with others so others find out about us. So especially if you find it helpful in your life. And if you could, take a minute to comment so people will know why you like Everyday Buddhism. Okay, that's it for the announcements this time. And so until next time, keep finding ways to make yours and everyone's days better.